You breathe roughly 15,000 times a day, and not once has anyone told you that each of those breaths is working a pump, a real mechanical pump, moving real fluid through 600 filtration stations scattered the length of your body, carrying the waste your cells throw off, the immune cells your body sends out to patrol, and the inflammatory debris your tissues need hauled away. That pump has been running since the day you were born. It runs on a single muscle. The muscle sits at the floor of your lungs and the roof of your organs, a broad dome of tissue you have never once thought about, and every time it moves to its full range, the pump takes a full stroke. Every time it barely stirs, the fluid it was built to shift stays exactly where it was, waiting for a stroke that never comes. Start with what you can feel, because you have almost certainly felt this: the puffiness in the legs and the ankles by evening, the shoes that fit in the morning and pinch by night, the heaviness that settles into the whole body after a long day at a desk, a weighed-down feeling that sitting up straighter never seems to lift, the stiffness that has no obvious injury behind it, the faint bloating, the feeling of being waterlogged in a way that a stretch or a glass of water never quite resolves. Most people file all of this under tiredness, or getting older, or the weather, or simply the price of a busy life, and some of it is those things. But what if a good share of it is simpler and more mechanical than any of that? What if a real part of it is fluid, plain ordinary fluid that should have been collected and carried away and returned to the bloodstream? Instead, it sits in the tissues where it was never meant to stay, because the pump built to move it has been idling at a fraction of its power for years on end, and you never knew the pump was there. Here is the shape of the whole thing, stated once so the rest has something to hang on. The person who has breathed shallowly for 20 years has been running this pump at somewhere between 15 and 30% of its mechanical capacity for every one of those daily breaths. Picture that. A pump built for a full sweeping stroke, taking a shrug of a stroke instead, every waking hour for 2 decades. The fluid that should have been cleared is sitting in the tissues right now. What that stalled fluid does, once it settles in and stops moving, is the whole answer, and it is not pretty. But it will not make sense, and the fix will not make sense until you see how this pump was built to run in the first place. So let me build it for you piece by piece, and hold the answer until the machinery is clear. Begin with a fact that should stop you for a second. There is a fluid inside you, liters of it, that has no heart. Your blood has a heart, of course, a relentless pump firing 100,000 times a day and pushing 5 liters a minute through a closed loop of vessels. Everyone knows the blood has a pump. Almost nobody stops to ask about the other fluid. Because there is another one, 2 to 4 liters of it moving through you every single day, traveling a completely separate network of vessels and capillaries and hundreds of filtration nodes, and it is called lymph. And it has no pump of its own. The whole network runs without a heart, a motor, or any dedicated engine anywhere along its length. Yet it moves, every day, carrying a workload the blood cannot touch. Lymph carries the things blood leaves behind: cellular waste hauled out of the tissues, excess fluid that has leaked out into the spaces between your cells, immune cells riding from one station to the next, inflammatory signals being carried off for processing, even the fats absorbed from your last meal, ferried out of the gut through vessels built for exactly that purpose. It is a second circulation, running quietly in parallel with the one everybody knows about, and it handles the jobs the bloodstream cannot. So how does it move? By 3 mechanisms, none of them a heart. The first is the squeezing of your skeletal muscles as you move. Every time a muscle contracts, it bulges and presses on the lymph vessels threaded through and around it. Those vessels are fitted with one-way valves, so the squeeze nudges the fluid along in one direction only. This is the calf pump, the mechanism that carries lymph up out of your legs against gravity every time you take a step. It works only while you are moving, which is part of why sitting still for hours lets fluid settle in the legs. The second means is the pulse of your arteries. Your lymph vessels often run right alongside your arteries, and every heartbeat sends a pressure wave down the artery that presses rhythmically on the neighboring lymph vessel, milking it along a little with each beat. It is a gentle contribution, but it runs day and night without pause. And the third, the one that does the heavy lifting, is the diaphragm. That single dome of muscle is the primary pump for the great central lymph channel, the one that drains most of the lymph in your entire body. The diaphragm sits at the center of that transport, as shields mapped and tracing how lymph climbs the great duct of the chest. Most of your body's drainage, then, rides on one muscle. The legs have their pump. The arteries lend their pulse. But the muscle in the middle of you, the one moving all day and all night without pause, is the engine the whole system leans on. To see why that one muscle matters so much, you have to see where it sits, because the anatomy is the entire engineering of this pump. The diaphragm is the wall between two rooms. Above it, the chest, holding the lungs and the heart. Below it, the abdomen, holding the gut and the liver and the rest of the organs. It is a sheet of muscle drawn across the whole width of you like the skin of a drum, curved up into a dome. It flattens and drops with every breath in, and springs back up with every breath out. Now here is the part that turns plain anatomy into working machinery. Directly beneath the diaphragm, tucked right up against its underside, sits the largest lymphatic sac in the whole body, a collecting reservoir some 5 to 7 meters long. Every drop of lymph coming up from your legs, your pelvis, and your entire gut pools into that sac first, gathering there before it goes anywhere else. From the top of the sac rises a single channel, the body's main lymphatic highway. It climbs up through an opening in the diaphragm itself, travels up through the chest, and empties into a large vein just behind your left collarbone. Every drop of lymph from 3/4 of your body has to travel up that one channel, pass through that opening in the diaphragm, and reach the bloodstream there. It is a single-lane road, and the diaphragm stands directly over its on-ramp. Look at what that arrangement means. Well, the pump muscle rests directly on top of the collection reservoir. The muscle contracts and drops, the reservoir gets compressed from above, and the fluid inside it has nowhere to go but up the channel and out, whatever you want to credit for the design of the body. It placed the pump exactly where it would do the most good, resting its full moving weight on the very sac it was built to squeeze. Anatomy made the placement, and the placement made the pump. Put the muscle on top of the reservoir, and every contraction becomes a stroke. Which brings us to the physics of the stroke itself, the pressure story, and this is where the whole thing becomes not just plausible, but calculable. Notice your own breathing for a second right now. If your shoulders are rising and your belly is still, you are watching the shallow stroke happen in real time. What exactly happens in terms of pressure each time that muscle drops? Follow one breath in. As you inhale, the diaphragm contracts and drops downward. In the shallow breathing most adults do without thinking, that is 1 to 3 centimeters. In a full deep breath that reaches all the way down, it is 7 to 10. When it descends, it presses down on everything below it, and the pressure inside your abdomen rises by something on the order of 5 to 20 centimeters of water pressure. At the very same moment, that same descent is enlarging the chest above, and the pressure up there drops, going negative, pulling downward from 6 or 8 centimeters of water in a quiet breath to 30 or more in a deep one. Hold both of those in mind at once, because together they make a gradient, and the gradient is the engine. Down in the abdomen, pressure high. Up in the chest, pressure low. The collection sac sits in the high-pressure zone below. The channel it feeds empties into the low-pressure zone above. And fluid, obeying the oldest rule in physics, flows from high pressure toward low. One inhale squeezes the sac from above and, at the same moment, opens a low-pressure space overhead for the fluid to rush toward, so the lymph is pushed from below and pulled from above in the same motion. It drives a slug of lymph upward through the channel. The system is fitted with one-way valves along its length, little gates that snap shut to stop the fluid sliding back down when you breathe out. So the exhale does not undo the work. The exhale simply lets the sac refill from the body below it, and the next inhale drives the next slug upward, and the one after that drives the next. Breath by breath the fluid climbs, and the valves make sure every hard 1 centimeter is kept. This is not a theory built from armchair reasoning. Moriondo and colleagues measured the pressures this pump generates directly, tracking how the diaphragm's movement drives lymph through the system, and confirmed that the breathing muscle acts as a genuine mechanical pump on the fluid beneath it. The gradient is real. It has been measured, and the numbers behave exactly as the anatomy predicts they should. Because this is physics rather than hand-waving, you can put numbers to the output. The amount of fluid the pump moves depends on two things multiplied together: how far the diaphragm travels on each stroke and how many strokes it takes in a given time. Push either one up and the flow rises. Push both up and it rises steeply. Work out the arithmetic from the measured travel distances and the measured pressure differences, and a deep, full breath moves lymph at something like 3 to 5 times the rate of a shallow one. That multiplier is a calculation drawn from the established measurements rather than a single figure read straight off a machine, but the inputs underneath it are solid physiology. Turn the same arithmetic the other way and you arrive back at the number from the very beginning. The shallow breather, taking those small sips of only an inch or so of travel, runs this entire pump at 15 to 30% of what it was built to do. For every full stroke the pump could take, the shallow breather takes a fraction of one, over and over, all day long. So the pump is real, the pressure gradient is real, and the output can be counted. So what shrinks the stroke? What takes a pump capable of full, sweeping travel and leaves it idling at a fraction of its reach? 3 things do it, and they tend to arrive together, stacking one on top of another on the very same muscle. First is simply shallow breathing itself, and Courtney, surveying the whole territory of dysfunctional breathing, cataloged just how common and how consequential this pattern is. Stress pulls the breath up high into the chest, priming the body to breathe fast and shallow the way it would in a moment of danger. Sitting still all day gives the diaphragm no reason to work hard, and decades of habit train the body to breathe from the upper chest, shoulders rising and falling while the diaphragm barely stirs, traveling that minimal 1 to 3 centimeters and no further. The pump runs at its lowest possible stroke volume, breath after breath, year after year, and the person doing it has not the faintest idea that any pump is involved at all. It feels like breathing. It is breathing. It is just breathing that leaves 3/4 of the pump's stroke on the table. Second comes a mechanical restriction, and it is the one that ties this straight to the belly. Visceral fat, the deep fat packed in around the organs rather than under the skin, takes up room inside the abdomen. As it accumulates, it presses upward on the underside of the diaphragm and shoves the whole dome higher into the chest than it was meant to sit. And a diaphragm crowded upward from below simply has less room to descend into. It runs out of travel before it should, hitting the crowded organs beneath it and stopping short. This is the cruel part, and it is worth saying plainly. The person carrying significant visceral fat cannot fix the stroke with breathing technique alone, because the space the diaphragm needs to drop down into is already occupied. And the loop turns on itself viciously. The very same stress hormones that drive the shallow chest breathing in the first place also drive the body to lay down more of exactly this deep visceral fat, which crowds the diaphragm further, which shortens the stroke again, which stalls the pump further still. Third, and least suspected, is your posture. Sit hunched forward at a desk for hours, day after day, year after year, and the junction where your lower ribs meet your lower back stays folded shut in that collapsed position. Now the diaphragm does not just float freely. It anchors down into that very region with 2 muscular legs, tendons that reach down and grip the front of the spine to give the dome something to pull against. And when that junction stays folded closed for years on end, those anchoring legs slowly adapt and tighten up. It is the same quiet remodeling any muscle does when it is held short for long enough. Once those anchors have tightened and shortened, they physically restrain how far the diaphragm is able to pull downward, tethering it from below. So the person who sits all day carries a postural brake on the pump, bolted right on top of the shallow breathing habit and, often enough, the fat displacement as well. 3 separate restrictions, all landing on one muscle, all conspiring to pull the same stroke shorter and shorter. You now understand the pump, the pressure that drives it, and the 3 forces that stall it. Which leaves the one thing this whole discussion was built to answer, the question the title asked and has been holding back. What actually happens to the fluid when the pump stops moving it? What does stagnation do down in the tissues once the lymph stops flowing the way it should? 4 things happen, and they happen together. The first is the simplest to picture. Your blood capillaries are always leaking a little fluid out into the spaces between your cells, all day, every day, entirely by design. That slow seep into the tissues is constant and normal. The lymphatic system is precisely what collects the leaked fluid and carries it back to the bloodstream. As Levick and Michel established in working out the fine balance of how fluid, crosses those capillary walls. That return trip is the only way the leaked fluid ever gets home. So slow the collection stall the lymph, and the leaked fluid has nowhere to go. It sits. It pools in the tissues, and it settles where gravity pulls it. Which is why the legs and the ankles feel puffy and heavy by the end of the day, why the whole body can feel waterlogged and swollen in a way that matches nothing you actually did. That heaviness is physical and real, and you could point to its cause. It is the fluid the pump was supposed to carry away, still sitting there, because the pump barely moved all day. Second, and quieter, and more important, your tissues lose their way of clearing inflammation. Lymph is the route by which your tissues ship their inflammatory signaling molecules off to the nodes to be dealt with, the messenger chemicals of inflammation, the ones with technical names like tumor necrosis factor and interleukin-6. These molecules are the body's own signals released on purpose to call for repair and defense, and in the right amount for the right length of time they are exactly what healing requires. The trouble is duration and concentration. When the lymph keeps flowing, those signals get carried away to the nodes and cleared at a steady, healthy pace, doing their job and then leaving. When the lymph stalls, they linger. They sit in the tissue at higher concentrations for longer stretches than they were ever meant to, because the clearance route that should have flushed them onward has slowed to a trickle. And a signal that was meant to flash briefly and fade instead stays lit. In the places where lymph is the main way, inflammation gets cleared. A real part of the ache and soreness is precisely this. Inflammatory molecules pooling in the tissue where they should long since have been swept away. This does not mean stagnant lymph is the sole cause of anyone's pain, and it would be dishonest to claim it were. It means the stagnation compounds whatever inflammation is already present, adding its own weight on top, one contributor stacked onto the others rather than the single source of them. The third consequence reaches into your immune defense, and it changes how well your body watches itself. Your immune cells do a great deal of their patrolling by riding the lymph from one filtration node to the next. Those nodes are the checkpoints where the body inspects what the lymph is carrying and mounts a response if it finds a threat. The traffic through those checkpoints depends entirely on flow. Slow the flow, and fewer immune cells pass through each node in a given hour. The whole surveillance network, the system that is supposed to be constantly sampling and checking and responding to what turns up, simply runs slower, with less traffic reaching the very stations that do the inspecting. The defense stays on. It simply patrols less often, the rounds spaced further apart, so more can slip past between them. The immune cells that would have caught a problem early are still made, still capable, still willing. They just arrive at the checkpoint later and in smaller numbers because the current that carries them there has slowed. Reduced flow means reduced watch. Forth comes the plain accumulation of ordinary waste. Every cell in your body is constantly producing metabolic garbage as it goes about its work, the spent byproducts of staying alive. The veins carry off a great deal of that load, but the lymphatic system is what clears a meaningful share of whatever the veins miss. When the lymph sits still, that share simply stops being cleared. The waste lingers in the fluid around the cells, and that lingering is what gets felt as the stiffness, the dull achiness, the sense of a body that has not been properly rinsed out. There is nothing exotic about it. The fluid that should have carried the garbage away is not moving, so the garbage stays where it was made, and the tissue it stays in is the tissue that aches. The fluid pooled and the inflammation concentrated. The immune traffic thinned and the waste built up in the tissue around the cells. 4 consequences from one stalled pump, and here is the genuinely hopeful part. A single action reverses all 4 of them at once, and it has been hiding in plain sight this whole time, sitting in the testimony of people who stumbled onto it without ever understanding why it worked. Think about who tends to report feeling unexpectedly well inside their own bodies, lighter and clearer than their age or their habits would predict. Singers, players of wind instruments, the flute and the trumpet and the clarinet, people with a serious meditation or breathwork practice. For generations, these people have described a lightness and ease, a sense of the body running clean, and they have mostly chalked it up to relaxation or discipline or the general good of the activity. The real reason underneath it is mechanical, and it is specific, and so every one of those practices runs the diaphragm through its full range, over and over, for the length of the session. A singer sustaining a long phrase, a flautist holding a line, a meditator drawing slow, full breaths for 20 minutes, is operating the lymph pump at or near its full capacity the entire time. Thousands of complete strokes where most people would have taken shallow sips. But the diaphragm does something else on its way down. This is where one muscle turns into three separate gifts. Your body's great calming nerve, the vagus, runs the entire rest and recover side of your physiology, slowing the heart and settling the gut and standing the body down from alertness. And it passes directly through the diaphragm on its route between the chest and the abdomen. So a full descent gives that nerve a gentle mechanical nudge with every stroke. The calm side of the nervous system gets stimulated in the very act of pumping lymph, and there is a third layer on top of even that. The long, slow exhale these practices train is itself a direct trigger for that same calming shift, tipping the whole body further toward its recovering state. So the singer holding a long note is quietly doing three things at once with one muscle: driving the lymph pump at full stroke, nudging the calming nerve, drawing out the exhale that settles the entire system. One muscle, three benefits, none of them requiring anything more exotic than learning to move the diaphragm through its full and natural range, which points straight at the way out, and the way out is almost aggressively simple. The diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, the very same kind of muscle as the ones in your arms and your legs, and skeletal muscle responds to training in the way skeletal muscle always has. Work it deliberately and it adapts. Ask it to travel further, and over time it learns to travel further at rest without you having to think about it. A stretch of consistent practice on the order of 4 to 6 weeks is enough to raise how far the diaphragm descends on an ordinary breath and to lift the baseline flow of the pump accordingly. You are not learning a trick, you are retraining a muscle back toward the range it was always built to use, and unlike so much health advice, this one does not ask you to buy anything, add anything, or find extra time in your day. You already breathe all day, every day, without thinking about it. The only change is how far the muscle moves on some fraction of those breaths, a few minutes of deliberate deep breathing that gradually teaches the diaphragm to sit lower and travel further even when you are not thinking about it. And as the flow comes back up, it begins clearing exactly what the stagnation had let pile up, in the same order the stagnation created it. The pooled fluid drains, and the puffiness and the heaviness recede. The concentrated inflammatory signals get carried off to the nodes at last, and their contribution to the ache eases. The immune traffic picks back up, and the patrol through those filtration stations returns toward the pace it should always have run at. The lingering metabolic waste finally gets rinsed away, and the stiffness loosens its grip. Each one of those improvements rides directly on the rise in flow, and the rise in flow rides on the one and only thing in this entire system you can actually reach and change: how far the muscle travels on each breath you take. 15,000 breaths a day, each one either a pump stroke or a stroke, the fluid missed. The diaphragm, dropping a full 7 centimeters, presses down on the collection sac, drives a slug of lymph up the great channel, and empties it into the vein behind the collarbone, working across the pressure gradient that the inhale opens and the valves hold. The next breath drives the next slug, and the one after that the next. The person who breathes shallowly for 20 years ran this pump at a fraction of its reach for every one of those 15,000 daily strokes. The fluid sat, the inflammatory signals concentrated, the immune traffic slowed, and the waste gathered. The pump was always there, and so was the muscle, and so was the pressure physics, waiting the whole time. The pump stalled because the strokes went shallow, whether the breath rose into the chest, or the belly crowded the muscle from below, or the hunched spine tethered it short. 3 pats, one result, a stroke that never reached its depth. The reversal begins with the first breath that reaches the abdomen.